Okay, so Quentin takes his watch to a clock repair shop, and he asks if any of the watches there are right. None of them are. And there's a dozen watches in the window, he says, all contradicting each other. Another little quotation from the father. I gave some page numbers here for you if you want to use any of this. But he says, clocks slay time, which is dead as long as it's being clicked off by little wheels. Only when the clock stops does time come to life. So there's kind of another contradictory or paradoxical utterance coming from the dad in this case. In his chapter, he interacts with several black men. And one thing I'd suggest to you is pay close attention to the difference between Compson time and the black character's times. And, you know, not just Dilsey's family, but there is also in Quentin's chapter up there in Massachusetts, you know, he meets several northern blacks, you know, and not just the one we wrote about in our first essay, but there's this one by the train who's there with this mule who's really described as kind of like a rabbit of a mule. And he describes this black man as being motionless and unimpatient, having a quality of timeless patience and static serenity. Contrast this acceptance of time with the Compson rejection of time. You know, father saying time is your misfortune. Well, if you're the Compsons and you've been all that, maybe time and the passing of time has been, you know, at least in worldly ways, your misfortune. But for them, maybe. But for the black characters, it seemed to be, I just feel like this one character just kind of seems totally at peace, waiting there by the train with his mule, and he's not in a hurry like Jason, and he just kind of seems to be at one with the moment.
He wants to do.
And who do we see being of service in the story, you know? Who do we see being of service? Doing things out of service for others. It's the black characters. So we had a hand here. And contrast their ease with the moment with Quentin, who can't escape from time. Jason, as you'll see, you know, in his chapter, he never has enough time. He's running all over trying to find a blank check. After he gets the money order, he has to find another check to forge for his mother to burn. He finally finds one and said, oh, this one's not from the right bank, but it'll have to do. I don't have any more time. I talked about this passage from page 196 where Jason says, maybe I'll learn how to stop my clock with a nose spray. He's so bitter about Quentin's suicide. He feels like Quentin was selfish, doesn't he? So in his chapter, Jason's hurrying impatience, he exaggeratingly says that it took about a week for the guy to get back with his car. He's waiting for a black man to bring him his car. Asked Dilsey to hurry up with lunch. His lunch with his mother causes him to be late getting him his stocks. So this motif of time doesn't just pervade the Quentin chapter, but I would argue it also is a big factor in the Jason chapter. Just in this direction, right?
Running towards
and well, you know, in a way, if you're trying to catch up with time and if you're late, aren't you kind of in a way trapped by the past? So it's kind of ironic. So he says, damn little time to do anything in. So let's sum up these Compson brothers, okay? And then we'll get into chapter 4. So I think we would agree Quentin sees time as a trap. Jason, for him, time is a tormentor, maybe. Time is something he can't seem to catch. To some extent, Benji seems freed from time. And there's a little bit of a sense that maybe he has these kind of oracular powers to look into the future. We're told on page 90 in Quentin's section, Benji knew it when Damity died. He cried, he smelt it. So he had like this sixth sense of being able to know when the moment when Grandma died upstairs. And this is a point we were talking about earlier. If the sound and the fury is narrated by an idiot, going back to Shakespeare's passage. The Benji seems idiotic to us when we first read that chapter, right? But that's because we wanted him to deliver his narrative in a linear way. But it's this linearity, this linear aspect to time, that's the problem, I would argue, not just for the Compsons, but for humanity. So we're going to make this idea bigger, okay? So let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so for Macbeth, who sees time as something deceptive, okay, life makes no sense. Benji's tells time he's maybe its first-time reader. Quentin has his own Macbeth-like nihilism. We talked about the shadows, Quentin's obsession with shadows, reflecting a nihilistic attitude. And I tried to support the claim that the shadow motif in Quentin's chapter is just a further reinforcement of time, but also yet one more strand for Faulkner to connect his book to this Shakespeare passage. Okay, that's there in front of you. Okay, the Compson family, chaos family, just like Macbeth is a chaos king. Macbeth invokes chaos, and here's where we get back into some of that idea of paradox. And we see in Act 3, he's saying, let the frame of things disjoint, let both worlds suffer, whether it's our world or the afterlife, let it all kind of go to hell. He's kind of, several times, if you know the play, he kind of invokes chaos, and for things, he's basically wanting to rip up fate. And at the same time, and this is where the paradox comes in, Macbeth is very dissatisfied that the world doesn't behave as expected. You know, he doesn't expect when Banquo's ghost comes back from the dead. It's like, you know, I had this guy assassinated. He should have stayed dead. Why people who are murdered are supposed to stay dead? Daggers aren't supposed to float in the air, you know. So forests aren't supposed to move, you know. Forests have roots. So there are all these weird things that happen that Macbeth finds unacceptable. But he himself has invoked a world that tears down all order. But when that order is not there to his satisfaction, it's not acceptable. And I think we see the same thing with the Compsons. You know, Caddy rejects her southern bellehood. Jason has to deal with a money order instead of a check. One of the motifs in Macbeth is this idea of paradox. Remember, a paradox is a statement. Paradox is words. It's a sentence that contradicts itself. And you see these peppered all the way throughout Macbeth, starting with the very first scene when the witches chant, fair is foul, foul is fair. Lady Macduff says that her son is fathered, but yet fatherless. The witches say Banquo will be lesser than Macbeth, yet greater. Not so happy, yet much happier, meaning not as lucky. Macbeth talks about making good of bad, making friends of foes. So we keep hearing these paradoxical utterances. And we begin to see how this can tie into the Sound and the Fury in chapter 4, okay? And I want to, in particular, draw your attention to Reverend Shegog's sermon. Phronie's sitting there next to her mother, Dilsey, who's heard this sermon, Easter Sunday, which is about, of course, Easter is about the resurrection of Christ. And Dilsey's crying. I'm going to turn to page 297 quickly, on the bottom half of page 297. And Dilsey's crying, and we're told that she sat bolt upright beside Ben, crying rigidly and quietly in the annealment and the blood of the remembered lamb. And Dilsey says, I seed the first and the last. Never mind. First and last of what? So Phronie, her daughter, doesn't get it at all. Never you mind, I seed the beginning, and now I see the ending. And in Revelation 22, Jesus speaks to John and says, look, I'm coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to each person according to what they have done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And this is, I think, what Dilsey's able to see, literally from from the sermon that she does, which is, there's this kind of way of preaching in those churches. And the interesting thing about Reverend Shegog, and I would note this if I were you, is pay close attention to Faulkner's emphasis on his physical appearance. And he's especially contrasted with their normal preacher, because he's a visiting preacher, and they're expecting him to be this amazing preacher, right? And they're not impressed with him at all when they first see him physically. He's kind of scrawny, and Faulkner's narrator describes him as having a face like a wizened monkey. He's just this kind of unintelligent-looking guy, and compared to kind of the imposing figure of their normal pastor. But when Reverend Shegog starts to speak, what's he sound like? He sounds like an educated white man from the north. So Shegog comes down there to Mississippi to deliver this sermon to this little church, and he sounds like a white guy, and nothing's really happening. Everyone's kind of off-put, but then he immediately kind of morphs into kind of this, he starts speaking, the Ebonic way of speaking, right? The appearance being kind of a problem for this congregation. When the visitor rose to speak, he sounded like a white man. His voice was level and cold. It sounded too big to have come from him, and they listened at first through curiosity as though they would have listened to a monkey talking. They began to watch him as they would a man on a tightrope, so they're just kind of fascinated by him. They even forgot his insignificant appearance in the virtuosity with which he ran and poised and swooped upon the cold, inflectionless wire of his voice. So they're just kind of transfixed by this, it's almost kind of, detached voice coming from this strange body. And top of page 294, then a voice said, "Brethren." The preacher had not moved, but there's this new voice. It was as different as day and dark from his former tone. It's like he becomes this other person just in a moment. He says, "Brethren, brethren and sisterin," and then he starts to talk like one of the people, right? Because he's in a black church, and he has to drop this kind of educated white voice he brought to it, and he has to sound like one of them, just for his ethos. And it's Easter Sunday, so it's a sermon about the resurrection, and he begins preaching. And let's turn to the top of 296 briefly. It says, "Brethren, look at them little children sitting there. Jesus was like that once. He, mammy, suffered the glory and the pangs. Sometime maybe she held him at the nightfall, whilst the angels singing him to sleep. Maybe she look out the door, see the Roman police passing." He tramped back and forth, mopping his face. "Listen, brethren, I sees the day. Mary sitting in the weird Jesus on her lap, the little Jesus like them little children there, the little Jesus. I hears the angels singing the peaceful songs and the glory. I sees the closing eyes, sees Mary jump up, sees the soldier face. We're going to kill your little Jesus. I hears the weeping and the lamentation of the poor mammy without the salvation and the word of God." And they're connecting. We get the sound of the crowd. He says, "I sees it, brethren, sees the blasting, blinding light. I sees Calvary with the sacred trees, those are the crosses. Sees the thief and the murderer and the last of these. I hears the boasting and the bragging. If you be Jesus, lift you up your tree and walk. I hears the wailing of the women and the evening lamentations." So he's telling kind of the crucifixion story here. And then top of 297, "I sees the resurrection in the light. Sees the meek Jesus saying, 'They killed me, that you shall live again. I died, that them what sees and believes shall never die.'" And Dilsey just takes this, right, and says, "I see the beginning and the end." Okay, so what we're seeing is Dilsey sees all of this in this moment, right, but in a different way. Okay, so now Caroline Compson, who's always got the Bible next to her, she has this kind of what I would say is a faux faith. She And she can't even really see the Bible. Dilsey, says, you want to read your Bible. But Dilsey sees the resurrected Christ as an answer to this trap, okay, that we see for the Compsons. And Dilsey even is able to make sense out of Compson time. The clock's always chiming the wrong, there's a clock on the mantle in the kitchen, and it's always kind of ringing the wrong number of times for the hour it is, but Dilsey always knows what time it is because she kind of is able to read that. So her spiritual vision is what Macbeth, the Compsons, and all nihilists lack, okay? An access to some meaning that transcends. You guys know what that word transcend means? That rises above this. That takes us off of being pinned to this line. She's got a faith that relieves her of this, okay? And you become spiritual when you get out of this trap of past, present, and future. Because the opposite of this is eternity, right? The opposite of time is eternity, where there is no boundary of space and time, right? Eternity and infinity. So Dilsey connects us. She has access to a meaning through her religion, through her faith that connects somehow to that mystery of eternity and infinity. Often the greatest part of the truth is hidden from us, and we learn about that problem with the ethos and the daemon, the dysoi logoi, that, for on any given subject, there's a truth that's hidden from us. Behind the truth that we can see, there's a hidden truth. And the tragic figure's ananoresis happens, remember that? When he sees the light, when he can see the truth that's been hidden from him. So, now Quentin's suicide, I'm arguing here in this slide, is analogous to Oedipus's angst when he gouges out his eyes. We read Oedipus earlier this year, and Oedipus gouges out his eyes because the world has become too ugly for him to look on, right? So he has his kind of existential crisis. But for Quentin, I just think he can't envision a future that's not going to be tainted by this incalculable loss. And again, I would say you got to go past Caddy's virginity. It's really about the loss of a whole culture. Yes. Look, man, think of the Compson family as a microcosm for the South. Look, for a lot of people, the past is just a well from which you drink your resentments. People brooding about things that didn't work out, and they get these resentments, and that's what we call baggage. And you carry that with you your whole life. And then for a lot of people, the future is just their fears and worries. So, I mean, if your head's in the past and if it's in the future, you're in very unspiritual places. If you're not right here, or better yet, not even on this line, your head's not in a good space. That's what Faulkner's trying to teach us here. And I think that's what Reverend Shegog is teaching. And Dilsey gets it. For her, and I think for Benji, time isn't linear, it's cyclical. Everything connects. The beginning is the end, which is just the beginning of the end again. I see the beginning, I see the end. It's all of a piece. Jesus saying in Revelation, I am the Alpha, I am the Omega. It's not like you can separate these things out. And so for Benji, he's probably the most spiritually pure vessel, in the story, But Dilsey sees it. Okay. So, of course, this seeing the beginning, seeing the end. Of course, this is what Caroline Compson can't do. We hear she has problems, literally, with her eyes. Okay. She can't even let the light in. She has to keep the room dark. So I think there's a figural and literal meaning there to contrast these two matriarchs. Contrast Caroline Compson with Dilsey. Dilsey who sees the light, Caroline who finds full, literally. Ironically, though, Mrs. Compson's the person most consumed with appearances. And I think, so if she's obsessed with appearances, to me, it kind of reminds me of Lady Macbeth, who constantly keeps telling Macbeth, hey, man, you look like you're freaking out. You got to pretend like everything's okay. She's constantly trying to smooth Macbeth's appearance. Hey, we got to look like we're not guilty here. Look like the time. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. I think what Faulkner's trying to teach us is that if our mind is anywhere on this line, we're not having a spiritual moment.
What do you mean?
You notice that, you guys who are athletic, when you're in the middle of a play, it feels good because you're relieved from that chatter of all the ego and everything up there. And I play music, and that's what has the same effect on me when I'm playing with my band and we're in the middle of a song. It's just like you're not thinking about anything else, And I think that's also why we like laughter. People will pay money to go see comedians. Why does it feel so good to laugh? Because when you're laughing, you're in the moment. You're in the now when you're laughing. And that's when we're real. That's when we're awake. That's when we're conscious. When we're right here, if my mind is here or here and I'm not here with you, I'm not here awake with you. I think that Faulkner and Shakespeare in Macbeth are trying to teach us to live this way. Because if we can live this way, then that's the reality where we're at our most pure. Okay? When we get bogged down in the past, future, get on this pin to this line, that's when we end up having these, that's what corrupts us. What this is eternity. So if you're in eternity, you're in the realm of that infinity, that eternal sphere, So the opposite of eternity is us getting bogged down with this, recorded time.
We are on that timeline.
We have our little box of space and time, but at least for Dilsey, she's able to see that there's something outside of that.
Okay, so it's just the concept that, theoretically.
I think the lesson is try to reject the temptation to stay on that timeline and try to see the wholeness of things. I think we're done here.
Yeah.
Okay.